On April 30th, Walpurgis was observed. People gathered around bonfires, danced, and marked the turning of the season in the dark. They have been doing it on this same night in Europe for centuries. The same night witches were said to gather on a mountaintop and make their covenant with the devil. Today we are going to show you exactly how that image traveled from a German mountain to a pasture in Danvers, and what it cost 19 people in Salem in 1692. Welcome to The Thing About the Salem Witch Trials. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
This is Sarah Jack. How did a European spring festival end up tangled in the Salem Witch Trials? It starts with a Maypole, runs through witches' meetings with the devil in plain sight, and ends with a 400-year-old pear tree still standing in a Danvers, Massachusetts parking lot.
When we take the time to look at modern celebrations like Walpurgis Night bonfires and May Day, we can see how these festive traditions are living evidence of the same cultural current that Puritan New England spent decades trying to suppress.
The celebrations happening right now help us understand that Salem did not happen in a vacuum. It happened at the intersection of ancient celebration and conflicting theology, and a fear that had been building for centuries.
What are the odds that John Endicott, Thomas Morton, and St. Walpurga herself all trace back to the same corner of England, and that place, Devon, quietly sits in the shadows of our story today?
Out of those shadows came a man that chopped down one of the earliest documented maypoles in colonial America. He planted a pear tree in Danvers around that same time, and that tree is still standing on the land his grandsons owned when 19 people were hanged for witchcraft nearby.
First, we need to go back to May 1st in Merrymount Colony in what is now Massachusetts. In 1627 and 1628, Morton erected a maypole at Merrymount and threw open the pagan celebration to English settlers and Native Americans alike. Dancing, feasting, May Day revelry in full view of Puritan New England.
Thomas Morton raised maypoles. He raised one in May 1627 and went ahead with a second in May 1628. Well, Miles Standish, yes, that Miles Standish, arrested him in June of 1628 and shipped him back to London. That winter, 1628 into 1629, John Endicott arrived in Namkeeg, what we now know as Colonial Salem, just months earlier, with roughly 60 settlers.
That winter, he rode out and raided Merrymount's corn supply, destroying what remained of the maypole per William Bradford's account. This was 2 full years before the Winthrop fleet arrived in 1630 with 700 settlers and transformed the colony into the Puritan powerhouse it would become under John Winthrop.
60 people, no charter yet, no Winthrop, and Endicott was already chopping down the unruly neighbor's maypole.
John Endicott is the man who, according to William Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation, destroyed Thomas Morton's maypole at Merrymount in 1629. That same John Endicott planted a pear tree on his orchard farm in what is now Danvers in approximately 1632 on 300 acres that were granted to him by the Massachusetts General Court on July 3rd, 1632.
His grandsons owned that land in 1692, the very land that Salem Village sat on during the witch trials. Also, the pear tree was there.
Nathaniel Ingersoll lived and worked on this farm as a child for 4 years, a detail that places the Endicott property at the center of Salem Village's social world long before 1692.
We learned some interesting things about John's son, Zerubbabel Endicott, when we had author Emerson Baker on the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast. Zerubbabel was a Harvard-educated doctor who kept a journal of medical recipes, including cat blood. He built a house in the 1680s in present-day Danvers that was disassembled in the 1970s, and that revealed protective folk magic artifacts hidden under the sheathing, like counter magic the family concealed.
So visiting for dinner, Reverend Paris never knew he was walking through a magically embedded threshold. Zerubbabel was involved in a land and firewood dispute with Reverend Allen and subsequently Francis Nurse. He died before the trials, making the land grab theory against the nurses unsupportable.
When we spoke with author Dan Gagnon on The Thing About Witch Hunts, we learned Zerubbabel's son, Samuel Endicott, inherited the land next to the nurses. Despite the family's prior disputes, he signed a petition defending Rebecca Nurse, a notable act of conscience given the neighborly history. The Rebecca Nurse homestead itself was originally Endicott's farm.
This same Samuel Endicott was a mariner who testified against Mary Bradbury, blaming her witchcraft for rancid butter, a violent storm, missing rigging, a salt-destroying leak, and a hallucination at sea in which he saw a woman's body separated at the waist. 11 years of grievance, one witch trial.
Samuel Endicott defended Rebecca Nurse, but accused Mary Bradbury.
11 years of simmering suspicion presented to a court as evidence of witchcraft. It is one of the clearest examples in the New England and Salem record of accusers weaponizing decades-old accidents and disputes. See how complex the Salem witch trials were? He acted as both a defender of one accused witch, Rebecca Nurse, and an accuser of another, Mary Bradbury.
So the pear tree John Endicott planted around 1630 is still alive today. It's located at 100 Endicott Street in Danvers. It's believed to be the oldest living cultivated fruit tree in North America. It was declared a national landmark in 2011 and is reportedly still producing fruit. The pears are identified with a variety of sugar pear that is hard and not pleasant raw, but it's great for baking tarts and pies.
In 1796, Reverend William Bentley visited the tree and wrote, "There is only one tree left which bears the sugar pear, and by tradition was planted in 1630. It is much decayed at bottom, but the branches at top are sound." In 1809, Bentley sent pears to former President John Adams, who planted seeds and wrote, "I have several young Endicotts in my garden."
In 1964, vandals unfortunately cut off all the branches and left a trunk using hacksaws. The tree recovered. In 1997, scions were collected for the National Colonial Germplasm Repository in Corvallis, Oregon. Then in 2012, a scion was planted in the hospital healing garden nearby and has reportedly grown into a small pear tree. A mural at Danvers Town Hall depicts Endicott's overseeing the plant. When Endicott planted, he may have said, "I hope the tree will love the soil of the old world, and no doubt when we have gone, the tree will still be alive." This quote is part of the tree's lore.
Did you know John Endicott served as an assistant governor on the general court that tried and convicted Margaret Jones of witchcraft in 1648? She was the first person executed for the crime of witchcraft in Massachusetts. The general court that heard her case consisted of Governor John Winthrop, Deputy Governor Thomas Dudley, and assistant governors including John Endicott, Richard Bellingham, William Hibbins, Richard Saltonstall, Increase Noel, Simon Bradstreet, John Winthrop Jr., and William Pynchon.
In Margaret Jones's case specifically, the Court of Assistants functioned as a trial court for capital crimes. The assistant governors weren't just observers, they were active participants in evaluating the evidence, and their collective vote determined her fate. It's worth noting that this was very different from modern courts. There was no independent judiciary, no defense counsel in any meaningful sense, and the men judging her were also the colony's political leaders. So this thread through Endicott is remarkable. This man arrived in Naumkeag in 1628 and destroyed Morton's Maypole over in Merrymount. He planted a pear tree on land that became Salem Village. He was part of the court that hanged the first person executed for witchcraft in Massachusetts. He also had grandsons who owned that same land in 1692 when 19 people were hanged for witchcraft.
Endicott died in 1665, well before the Salem witch trials. But his presence runs through almost every part of this story. He destroyed the Maypole. He convicted the first witch. He planted the tree.
I'm also very fascinated by the Maypole of Merrymount that Endicott chopped down, so I want to talk about that a little bit more.
Thomas Morton was an English lawyer and colonist who arrived in New England in 1624 as a senior partner in a trading venture led by Captain Richard Wollaston. Wollaston left for Virginia, and Morton soon learned he was selling the venture's indentured servants into tobacco plantation slavery.
Morton encouraged the remaining men to rebel, took control of the settlement, and drove Wollaston out for good. He renamed it Merrymount, a triple pun, the Latin word for sea, the English May Day word merry, and the classical idea of a mount as a place of learning and civilization. The Puritans later renamed it Merrymount.
Morton was an Anglican, while Plymouth was led by Congregationalists, the people we often know as Puritans. He used the Book of Common Prayer and celebrated English folk and classical traditions the Puritans considered incompatible with their godly order. William Bradford, governor of Plymouth Colony, called him the Lord of Misrule.
Thomas Morton opened direct trade with Native Americans, and according to his own account in New English Canaan, by 1626, his men had nearly put Plymouth out of business in the fur trade.
By the way, Plymouth had no legal jurisdiction over him.
So, in 1627 and 1628, when Morton erected a Maypole, he invited both English settlers and Native Americans to dance and celebrate in a manner of traditional English May Day, an act of open defiance that cut straight across Puritan authority.
Plymouth Colony Governor William Bradford responded in writing, comparing the revelers to fairies dancing and frisking together like so many fairies. Scholar Francis Young argues that Bradford's choice of the word fairies was a deliberate theological accusation.
In Puritan thinking, fairies, May Day, and paganism were part of the same condemned category, placing Morton's celebration outside of Christian society and therefore subject to punishment. The Maypole was Morton's assertion of freedom. Bradford's fairy comparison was Plymouth's assertion of control.
So every April 30th, bonfires light up, people gather and sing, and communities mark the turning of the season with fire and celebration. If you were on social media last night, you may have caught it. This is Walpurgis Night, and it has been observed on the eve of May 1st for centuries.
The night takes its name from St. Walpurga, an English-born missionary canonized by Pope Adrian II on May 1st in approximately 870 AD. But the tradition that bears her name is not a single thing. It is a collision of histories. Older pre-Christian May Eve practices, including the observance of Beltane, were already tied to the state across Northern Europe, and communities had long marked the turning of the season with fire and celebration.
By the 16th and 17th centuries, two distinct threads had wound themselves around the same date. The first came from Catholic tradition. St. Walpurga was believed to hold particular power against evil magic, which meant the eve of her feast day was understood as the night when that evil was strongest.
The second came from German folklore, specifically the Brocken, the highest peak of the Harz Mountains, where witches were said to gather for a Sabbath, dance through the night, and feast with the devil. Johannes Pretorius first recorded that gathering in writing in his 1668 Blacksburg performance. Goethe later immortalized it in his writing Faust.
By the 17th century, the saint and the Sabbath had fused into one night, and the Salem witch trial records show accused witches described as gathering on the Reverend's own lawn in the days leading up to May 1st in 1692.
The image of witches gathering in the dark was not invented in Salem 1692. It ran through colonial New England like a thread for 40 years before the first Salem accusations were ever made.
In Springfield in 1651, 41 years before Salem, Mary Louise Parsons told the constable she had prowled a neighbor's property at night with her husband and two women, sometimes like cats and sometimes in our own shape, a group, a night, animal transformation, bodies in the dark. This is the Walpurgis Night template, word for word, in the first witch panic on American soil.
In Hartford in 1662, 30 years before Salem, Rebecca Greensmith confessed under interrogation to ministers Reverend Haynes and Whiting, and Increase Mather published this account in his 1684 Remarkable Providences book, declaring it, quote, as convictive a proof of the reality of witchcraft as most single examples he had met with. She had, she said, familiarity with the devil, going with him when he called, which accordingly she had sundry times done. And he had promised that at Christmas they would have a merry meeting, and then the covenant between them would be subscribed.
She described the earlier gatherings, meeting under a tree at night with named neighbors, where we danced and had a bottle of sack, summoned by something like a cat. A witness independently testified to seeing women in the woods dancing around two black figures that were taller than men with a kettle over a fire. That looks like a Walpurgis Night celebration kind of thing. A Sabbath, a bonfire, you've got dancing creatures. It's got it all. This is 30 years before Salem, and Increase Mather had already written it down as proof of witchcraft.
The image did not fade away. It accumulated. Each decade brought new cases, new confessions, new accusations describing variations on this theme. People gathering in secret, in darkness, pledging themselves to forces outside the Puritan order. Accused witch of Boston, Mary Hale, was accused in 1680 by an afflicted sailor of gathering with 20 witches around a circle table, drinking wine.
During the Goody Glover case of 1688, Cotton Mather claimed that Glover confessed to attending meetings with her prince, the devil, alongside 4 other witches. According to Mather, Glover explicitly told him the names of those 4 confederates.
But Mather chose never to reveal their identities. He explained this omission by stating that he wanted to be tender in such matters so as not to wrong the reputation of the innocent by stories not enough inquired to.
By the time Salem erupted in 1692, the template was fully formed and deeply familiar to everyone in the colony. Accusers, accused, ministers, and magistrates alike.
The witch gathering was an established pillar of evidence. Across 4 decades of New England witchcraft prosecutions, the gathering in the dark had functioned as one of the most damning things a witness could describe or an accused could confess to.
It confirmed the devil's covenant. It named accomplices. It demonstrated organized collective rebellion against the Puritan order. A witch who acted alone was dangerous. A witch who attended a gathering was proof that Satan had built a church of his own inside the colony.
The Salem accusations in 1692 were all about the witches' meetings with the devil. Sarah Hawkes covenanting with the devil at 5 Mile Pond.
Mary Toothaker signing a piece of birch bark in blood. Accusers describing a Sabbath in Reverend Parris's own pasture, with George Burroughs presiding as ringleader of all the witches in New England, serving red bread and blood wine. These descriptions carried evidentiary weight. The pasture Sabbath was not a single accusation. It was a collaborative construction built from multiple testimonies that reinforced each other. Abigail Williams said she watched it happen. Abigail Hobbs said she was there. The community of confessors and accusers created a scene that gave the court exactly what it feared most.
At the center of the scene was a mock sacrament, a deliberate inversion of the Christian Eucharist. Abigail Hobbs testified that those gathered there served red bread and blood wine, a detail that fed directly into the established template of the witches' Sabbath as a blasphemous corruption of sacred ritual.
And presiding over it, according to the accusers, was George Burroughs, the former minister of Salem Village itself, a minister at the devil's table, serving corrupted communion to a congregation of witches. The authorities had long feared that Satan would build his church from the inside. Here, in sworn testimony, was the proof they needed.
The gathering confirmed the devil's pact. The gathering named others. The gathering was how the court understood what diabolical wickedness was causing afflictions.
The framework for the witches' Sabbath came from the same demonological literature that had produced Walpurgis Night. The same books Cotton Mather and Increase Mather had read and written. The same theological framework that said the devil organized his servants just as God organized his church. Walpurgis Night and the Salem Sabbath were drawn from the same source.
Interestingly, the New England witch gatherings were not specifically at night. Salem was not an aberration. It was a culmination, 40 years of accumulated fear and religious intolerance, a destabilized government, a lost charter, a frontier war, and a community in crisis.
All bearing down on an image that had been building evidentiary and theological weight locally since Springfield in 1651.
We hope you enjoyed exploring how ancient celebrations, religious intolerance, and the fear of the devil shaped the world that made Salem witch trials possible. It shaped our history.
And if you want to go deeper, we have you covered. Join us on Salem Witch Trials Daily for the trials day by day, or dig into our episodes right here on The Thing About the Salem Witch Trials for a closer look at the claims made against the accused and at the witches' Sabbath. Links are in the show notes.